blink of an eye. There. But bonds can earn more than what's on the front of them. Way more. Take it from me, the guy who invented money. U.S. savings bonds are a big improvement.
NATO leaders meet in Rome to assess their role in the post-Cold War Europe. A few communist diehards turn out to mark the Bolshevik Revolution, though the Soviet government has canceled the holiday. And the judge in the William Smith sexual assault case makes a ruling on cameras in the courtroom. CNN Headline News, I'm Lynn Vaughn. With the evil empire no longer viewed as so evil, the alliance set up to guard against it is heading in a new direction. NATO leaders have approved a new strategy with the biggest changes in the military alliance since it was founded in 1949. There was a flurry of activity at the meetings. Leaders agreed to establish a cooperation council which will hold consultations with East European countries. Ministers also expressed concern over the Soviet nuclear arsenal, given the turbulent political atmosphere there. The head of NATO says it must adapt to world changes.
History does not allow us to stand still. New challenges demand new answers. We must redefine the role and tasks of our alliance in the new political and military circumstances, and we must chart the future course of our alliance in shaping the new European environment.
President Bush had breakfast with British Prime Minister John Major. Major says the U.S. and Britain are there to reinforce NATO. France and Germany have suggested a European Union, including a joint army. That prompted President Bush to say if NATO wants the U.S. out of the fold, let him know now. U.S. officials expect a positive response, however. Rob Reynolds reports on how regional changes could affect the alliance.
Stunning changes in Europe's balance of power could make the Rome meeting a crucial turning point for NATO. Among the issues, will Europe move ahead with plans to handle its own defense outside the NATO alliance and without the participation of the United States?
There's certainly a school of thought in the more continental of the European nations, and Germany and France in particular, that perhaps the transatlantic connection with the United States and Canada is no longer relevant in this post-Cold War period.
With the threat from the East greatly diminished by the collapse of the Soviet Union, the U.S. plans large cuts in troops and tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. And with the European community moving closer to economic and political unity, France and Germany have proposed the creation of armed forces controlled not by NATO, but by EC nations under an organization called the Western European Union. French President François Mitterrand is pushing hard for a European defense force. In October, he told French radio, "Europe is becoming a great power. Are we going to depend on others for our security?" German Chancellor Helmut Kohl supports Mitterrand's proposal. A small Franco-German brigade made up of soldiers from both countries already exists and could serve as a model for a future all-European defense force.
And Germany feels as the most, potentially the most powerful European country, particularly economically, that they really need to take a lead in security and military affairs as well. And I think this is what is partly behind this.
The Franco-German proposal has created fears of a split that could be fatal to the alliance. The U.S. says Europe's defense policy should complement NATO, not replace it.
The United States supports the development of a European security identity and defense role, reflected in the strengthening of the European pillar within the alliance, but one which will reinforce the integrity and effectiveness of NATO.
Britain wants any future European force to have a role separate from NATO, such as peacekeeping duties outside of the NATO region. And Britain's leaders want to keep the transatlantic ties strong.
The British experience, after all, is that when the United States withdraws from Europe, we have wars in Europe. And when the United States comes to Europe, the United Kingdom is successful in the wars which it's had to fight, and then when the United States has stayed, we've avoided war in Europe.
EC leaders will hammer out the terms of political and economic union at a meeting next month in the Netherlands. It's a sign of Europe's new self-confidence that that meeting could be more important to the future of European defense than the NATO gathering this week in Rome. Rob Reynolds, CNN, London.
In Moscow, several thousand communists marched into Red Square today, marking the anniversary of the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution. However, Soviet President Gorbachev canceled official ceremonies and the traditional Soviet military parade. Several hundred anti-communist demonstrators also rallied in Red Square to protest 7 decades of communist rule. In St. Petersburg, where the revolution started, tens of thousands of people demonstrated. Most of them were anti-communist too. Rescue teams in the Philippines say at least 3,400 people are dead and 2,000 missing after flash floods devastated the central part of the country. Many bodies that weren't swept into the sea are being buried in mass graves. The flooding triggered by Tropical Storm Thelma is the worst natural disaster in 15 years. Dutch transport authorities say the worst danger is over from a spill of highly explosive fuel this morning in the North Sea. The petroleum product spilled from a British tanker off the Dutch coast, but it is rapidly dissipating. The tanker was ruptured in a collision with a cargo ship. That vessel tore from its anchor in high seas. No injuries are reported. Air raid alarms sounded throughout the Yugoslav Republic of Croatia today as federal air warplanes attacked Croatia again. Airstrikes have been reported in 2 central cities. The Yugoslav army is giving Croatian fighters in the port city of Dubrovnik less than an hour to give up their weapons. City officials say they are ignoring that demand. The U.S. Senate plans to vote today on a bill that would temporarily suspend the Bush administration's ban on abortion counseling at federally funded family planning clinics. The House passed the measure yesterday. The margin was not large enough to override a threatened presidential veto. Congresswoman Pat Schroeder of Colorado called it a sad day. She says the House voted to treat women like children and not adults. Democrats say their stunning victory in Pennsylvania's Senate race showed health care is a big issue for voters. They're hoping that will help them win the White House next year. Candy Crowley reports.
There's more than the whiff of fall in the air. Inside the Capitol building, Democrats smell vulnerability.
George Bush may still prefer to run from the issue of health care, but the American people will no longer let him hide.
I've been listening to the fascinating array of material coming to the floor today. Fascinating stuff. Essentially, I gather it has to do with the demise of George Bush, and the demise of the Republican Party is almost an audible humming and harmonic accompaniment of happy days are here again.
A small exaggeration, but Harris Wofford, the Democrats' David, who slew Republican Goliath Richard Thornburgh, got everything but a drum roll on Capitol Hill Wednesday, having won his seat with a campaign emphasizing the need for national health care.
There's a nerve that we touched that's there.
Anxious to get some bounce off the Wofford victory, Democrats noted that George Bush doesn't have a comprehensive health care proposal and won't have one until after next November's elections.
That's not good enough. People don't become sick based upon the date of elections.
On both sides of the Hill, Democrats picked up the ball and ran with it.
We need a health care summit, Mr. President, with President Bush exercising his leadership.
Stop worrying about NATO and start worrying about Blue Cross.
But interpreting election results is a lot like reading entrails. Nobody's sure what they're seeing.
I think there is a pox on all of our houses, as I've already said, on both parties and on both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue in not coming to terms.
Republicans say whatever happened yesterday, it was not a public outcry for spending more money.
Yesterday confirmed the diagnosis we've suspected for years. The health system is sick. But what it did not do is prescribe the cure.
We all want affordable health care, but I tell you, let's find out where we're going to pay for it.
For Democrats this election season, that will be the rub. For while the White House may be vulnerable to charges, it's not dealing with the health care crisis. Democrats are wide open to complaints. They have more ideas than the Treasury has money.
That shows you just how much your savings might be. There's no obligation, no sales pressure, and it could be a real eye-opener. 800-257-1333 toll free. 257-1333. Call Garden State Life Insurance today. 257-1333.
Abortion rights advocates want the U.S. Supreme Court to take a new look at Roe versus Wade to determine if it's still the law of the land. NATO ministers meet in Rome and chart a new course for post-Cold War Europe. And the actor who created the children's character Pee Wee Herman enters a plea to indecent exposure charges. Headline News, I'm Chuck Roberts. The U.S. Supreme Court is being asked to rule quickly on abortion rights, perhaps in time to make it an election year issue in 1992. A coalition of groups is challenging Pennsylvania's abortion restrictions, which include requiring a 24-hour waiting period before an abortion is performed and parental notification or court approval for women under 18. Planned Parenthood and the American Civil Liberties Union are joining this effort to force the Supreme Court to declare its stand now. The timetable for a ruling isn't necessarily speeded up, but today's appeal could prompt the High Court to uphold or reject Roe versus Wade this term. Meanwhile, the Bush administration's gag rule prohibiting federally funded clinics from offering abortion counseling suffered a setback today. The Senate voted 72-25 to approve a measure that temporarily overturns the ban on counseling. That's more than enough to override a threatened veto, but the House fell just 18 votes short of a veto-proof majority in its vote yesterday. However, Democrats predict the gag rule opponents will pick up enough votes for an override. This bill would suspend the rules for only 1 year. That feature alone attracted many Republicans.
This is not an argument about abortion. The Title X program does not and never has paid for abortions. The disagreement, Mr. President, is over whether a poor woman is entitled to basic information. Shouldn't she be able to receive the basic information that a wealthier woman or a woman who can afford to pay a doctor would rightfully expect to obtain from a health care professional?
21 Republicans joined 51 Democrats in voting to permit abortion counseling. With the evil empire no longer viewed as so evil, the alliance set up to guard against its heading in a new direction. NATO leaders have approved a new strategy with the biggest changes in the military alliance since it was founded in 1949. There was a flurry of activity at the meetings today, leaders agreeing to establish a cooperation council which will hold consultations with East European countries. Ministers also expressed concern over the Soviet nuclear arsenal, given the turbulent political atmosphere there. The head of NATO says it must adapt to world changes. President Bush had breakfast with British Prime Minister John Major, who says the U.S. and Britain are there to reinforce NATO. It was a day official Moscow chose not to remember. Soviet officials canceled ceremonies marking the 74th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. But thousands of diehard communists turned out for their own celebration. Some even marched into Red Square. Anti-communists held rallies as well today. In nearby Menesa Square, hundreds paraded to show bitterness at what they believe has been 70 wasted years under communism. Most Muscovites had the day off work for the holiday. Many either stayed home or waited in lines for food, which has been in short supply lately. The city formerly named for the leader of the Bolshevik Revolution was also a mixed bag of emotion. St. Petersburg, which used to be called Leningrad, had its share of communist and anti-communist demonstrations. Penny Marshall reports on one celebrating democracy.
The church and the Romanovs have been reunited in the celebrations marking St. Petersburg's return to its pre-revolutionary Tsarist name. A symbolic alliance marking the death of Soviet communism and the atheistic state. Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, the heir to the Romanov Tsars, was blessed by the all-Russian Patriarch. The dukes returned here from exile in France to join the renaming celebrations. The great-nephew of Tsar Nicholas II, the Grand Duke was born in 1917, the year the Bolsheviks seized power, later assassinating the Tsar and practically the entire Russian royal family. In his homeland, for the first time, he called for a minute's silence in memory of his relatives. He says he'd like to return to Russia as Tsar if invited. Yesterday, the Communist Party was permanently banned in Russia. Today, in St. Petersburg, they danced on the party's grave. Filling Palace Square with the symbols of a dynasty and culture the communists have tried to destroy. And these anti-communists have seized Revolution Day and Palace Square, back from the Bolsheviks after 74 years. Nearby, though, die-hard communists did hold an alternative demonstration, protesting the party ban and the Democrats' handling of the economy. Today's celebrations, although rich in symbolism, will do nothing to convince critics like these that the Democrats can offer anything of substance. The politicians may have succeeded in reviving the czarist splendors of the past, but they face a much more difficult task, rebuilding a secure future, reconstructing an economy and a political system destroyed by 74 years of communism. Penny Marshall, ITN, St. Petersburg.
Rescue teams in the Philippines say 3,400 people are dead and 2,000 more missing after flash floods devastated the central part of the country. Many bodies that weren't swept into the sea are being buried in mass graves. The flooding triggered by Tropical Storm Thelma is the worst natural disaster in 15 years. Security sources say Israeli helicopters fired rockets into guerrilla-held areas in South Lebanon twice today. In one attack, an office used by the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine was hit. Witnesses say 2 civilians were killed and 3 others wounded. The attack occurred near the southern port city of Tyre. Israeli aircraft have attacked targets in Lebanon now 22 times this year. A former Israeli spy says British media magnate Robert Maxwell may have been killed. In a radio interview, the man says there are U.S. and Israeli officials who, along with Maxwell, were involved in arms shipments to Iran. He claims those officials may have wanted Maxwell kept quiet. Spanish coroners say Maxwell died of a heart attack Tuesday on his yacht off the Canary Islands. His body was found in the Atlantic a few hours later. Croatian officials are rejecting the Yugoslavian army's order defenders of the port city of Dubrovnik surrender their weapons. Fighting continued today despite a ceasefire arranged by the European community on Tuesday. The attacks are taking a toll on the city and on the 50,000 people trapped there since the army laid siege October 1st. Paul Davis has more.
The assault on Dubrovnik continues. Federal troops machine-gunning Croatian defenses from their mountaintop positions. In lulls in the fighting, the people emerge from their shelters to clear up the wreckage, to see what new damage has been inflicted on this besieged city. Yesterday's bombardment of Dubrovnik was the heaviest since the Serbian-dominated Federal Army first attacked the port 37 days ago. The building seen here taking a direct hit was Dubrovnik's prison, used these days to hold federal prisoners of war. One shell exploded through the roof into the POW cell block. An ironic tragedy was avoided by a few minutes, as the Serbian prisoners had all been evacuated to the jail's underground shelter.
5 mortars fell on this one small group of apartments. Miraculously, no one was seriously hurt, as the entire population of Dubrovnik had taken to the safety of the underground shelters.
At the height of the attack, Dubrovnik's famous Stradum main street, known to millions of tourists, deserted. Federal troops now hold the mountaintop behind the church tower. The heart of the old city is well within range of their guns. The only international body present in Dubrovnik today is the team of European Community observers. Even their boat has been fired on, and they may now be withdrawn if European ministers decide tomorrow to abandon their peace initiative. Paul Davis, ITN, Dubrovnik.
Flames broke out at 2 churches in St. Augustine, Florida today, the latest in a long spate of church fires in that state. The First Church of Christ Scientist was damaged by smoke and a classroom was destroyed. A fire was also reported at McDowell Baptist Church. 47 churches have been burned since April of last year. Authorities say 38 of the fires were set by arsonists. The man who created the kids show character Pee Wee Herman won't be going to jail. Actor Paul Reubens pleaded no contest today in a Florida court to charges of indecent exposure. He agreed to pay a $50 court fine and costs and produce an anti-drug commercial. Once he completes these conditions, Reubens will have a clean record.
He will not receive any kind of criminal record as a result of these proceedings. And as far as I'm concerned...
7-13-33. Or send just $19.99 for 3 records or 2 double-length cassettes, or $26.99 for 2 compact discs, plus $4 shipping and handling to Mormon Tabernacle Christmas Celebration, P.O. Box 8660, Atlanta, Georgia.
The career of one of the greatest basketball players of all time is cut short. Abortion rights advocates press the Supreme Court to take a stand on Roe versus Wade, and NATO announces its most sweeping strategy change ever. CNN Headline News. I'm Judy Fortin, sitting in for Lynn Russell. Pro basketball player Magic Johnson led the Los Angeles Lakers to 5 world championships, holds the career record for assists, and is a 3-time MVP. But he'll never play another NBA game. Less than an hour ago, Johnson announced his retirement because he's tested positive for the virus that causes AIDS. Johnson had missed the Lakers' first 3 games this season because of what the team described as the flu.
I would now become a spokesman for the HIV virus because I want people and young people to realize that they can practice safe sex. And, you know, sometimes you're a little naive about it and you think it could never happen to you. You only thought it could happen to, you know, other people and so on and on. And it has happened, but I'm going to deal with it and my life will go on.
The 32-year-old Johnson played 12 seasons in the NBA after leaving Michigan State before his junior year. Jim Huber reports throughout his career he's been a champion at every level.
If there was ever the perfect nickname for an athlete like Irvin Johnson, it was Magic, for he was that and just so much more. From his days in the 70s as an undergraduate at Michigan State, where he led the Spartans to the national championship, to just a month ago when he stunned Paris in an exhibition game with the Lakers, he produced from up an imaginary sleeve absolute brilliance. And because of that, he had an immediate impact on the NBA. He and Larry Bird came into the league on the very same day in 1979 and are generally credited with being the architects of the NBA's great rebirth. For openers, that a man 6'9" could play point guard was unthinkable, and play it with the kind of zest that Magic Johnson nightly displayed took that a step farther into incredulity. With that dazzling smile of his, he would cut down the lane, put opponents on their seats, and pull fans off theirs. And from opening day a dozen years ago, basketball was never again to be the same. His Los Angeles Lakers won the NBA championship his rookie year, and they won 4 more in the decade to follow. He was the league's most valuable player in 1987, 89, and 90, All-NBA every season from 83 on, the all-time NBA assists leader. He had not played in any of the Lakers' first 3 games of this season, suffering from what the team called dehydration from the flu, which he reportedly picked up while in Paris on that preseason tour. Irvin Johnson, NCAA champion, 5-time NBA champion, but just magic.
Doctors refuse to comment on how Johnson may have contracted the virus. Groups of abortion rights advocates are asking the Supreme Court to come clean on the Roe versus Wade decision that legalized abortion. Today they requested the justices review a lower court ruling that upheld a Pennsylvania law restricting abortions. They want the court to use that case to decide whether it still believes in a woman's right to an abortion. The groups say they expect the High Court to eventually overturn Roe versus Wade.
Driven by the Bush White House, the long-term anti-choice strategy is on the verge of being realized. The right to choose is about to be taken from women and handed to politicians. After more than a decade of court packing by Bush and Reagan, the loss of a fundamental right has gone from the inconceivable to the inevitable.
The Pennsylvania law imposes a 24-hour waiting period for women seeking abortions. A similar law was declared unconstitutional in 1986. The U.S. Senate has voted to lift the Bush administration's so-called gag rule. Lawmakers voted in favor of legislation suspending the rule banning abortion counseling at federally funded clinics. Supporters of the bill say poor women who are likely to use such clinics are entitled to such information. The bill now goes to the White House, where President Bush has threatened a veto. By more than a 10-to-1 margin, the House of Representatives today passed the 1991 Civil Rights Act. The bill now goes to President Bush, who has agreed to sign it. It makes it easier to bring job discrimination lawsuits and allows victims of sexual harassment to collect damages, in addition to back pay and court cost. House Speaker Tom Foley calls the bill's passage historic. One critic charges, quote, it enshrines racial quotas. Paul Rubens, the man who plays Pee Wee Herman, today pleaded no contest to indecent exposure charges. In a plea bargain, a Sarasota, Florida judge sentenced him to a $50 fine plus court cost. Rubens will also produce and pay for an anti-drug TV commercial to fulfill a community service requirement. The plea will leave him with no criminal record. Police arrested Rubens July 26th, saying they saw him masturbating in an adult movie theater. In West Palm Beach, Florida, lawyers for William Kennedy Smith today tried to bar television cameras from his rape trial. The motion failed, but the trial judge did restrict media coverage. Charles Jaco reports.
Tuesday, potential juror Florence Orbach shocks the courtroom with her opinions on the William Kennedy Smith case.
I think basically he's idealistic, but maybe he's a little horny, you know. Maybe, you know. So what's so bad about that?
Wednesday, Orbach tells Judge Mary Lupo she's been contacted by tabloid TV shows and other media. That violates Lupo's rule that the media should stay away from potential jurors.
She has been harassed within 24 hours of her answering questions in the courtroom.
Thursday, Smith attorney Roy Black argues that cameras should be excluded from the court because of media misconduct with Orbach.
The First Amendment right to gather the news is not an absolute right. It is conditioned on the rights under the Sixth Amendment.
Media attorneys fire back.
Short of Your Honor conducting this trial in a cave somewhere and closing the entire trial, the media is going to be reporting on what happens during jury selection.
Lupo rules cameras can stay, but the names of jurors will no longer be released, and she blasts the print and TV tabloids.
And I am sorry for those members of the media who have behaved so well and have been extremely honorable and ethical, that there are members among them who are unscrupulous. However, I urge you to police yourselves.
Which raises the issue of the kind of coverage this trial's receiving. The tabloids, both print and electronic, are here in force. They often sensationalize their stories. They sometimes pay for interviews and information, and that has led to all sorts of problems in this case. A tabloid, for example, printed the alleged victim's name and photo. The alleged victim was reportedly offered $500,000 by the TV show Hard Copy for an interview. Smith ripped into the tabloids and their treatment of Orbach.
There's a woman who's a very entertaining person, and certain unscrupulous people, you know, wanted to use her for entertainment and stepped all over the judicial process, you know, trying to do it.
And for now, the media, tabloids and all, will still be sending pictures from inside the courtroom, just without the names of the potential jurors. Charles Jaco, CNN, West Palm Beach, Florida.
America's European allies have assured President Bush they still want U.S. military help in Europe. Washington has been concerned that Europe's 1992 economic unification would spread to defense, effectively squeezing out the United States. Before the meeting, President Bush spelled out NATO's importance to U.S. defense policy.
We're going to have a sufficient force to take care of our obligation and our own national security interests, and one of those fundamental national security interest is a vigorous participation in NATO. It is in the interest of the United States to do this, as well as in the interest of the alliance. So that's the way I would handle that one, and I'm just going to not leave here until every single member of NATO understands that, but I think they all do.
NATO also agreed today to invite the Soviet Union and 8 former communist nations to join the organization in a new cooperation council. In Yugoslavia, Croatian leaders are fighting back in the port city of Dubrovnik. Today they rejected a federal army ultimatum to surrender. The city's mayor calls it out of the question. Today, federal forces mounted more air raids against Croatian villages. Airstrikes hit the town of Karlovac, and gun battles erupted tonight in the Croatian capital of Zagreb, putting the city under a state of emergency for 2 hours. The European community meets tomorrow in Rome to discuss the Yugoslavian crisis. Soviet citizens celebrated Revolution Day in extremely different ways today. In Moscow, about 5,000 people marched through Red Square, carrying signs supporting communism and blasting Soviet President Gorbachev. In St. Petersburg, even more people celebrated the fall of communism. Claire Shipman was there.
Revolution Day, in the birthplace of the revolution. But Leningrad is no more. Festivities this year are in honor of the restoration of the city's original name. And St. Petersburg residents got more than their name back. Grand Duke Vladimir Kirillovich, heir to the throne, arrived from Paris at the invitation of St. Petersburg Mayor Anatoly Sobchak, but only for a visit. It's a feeling of indescribable joy to set foot for the first time on the land of my ancestors, he says, to return to my motherland. The Grand Duke plans to visit a number of ancestral haunts. This church marks the spot where his great-grandfather, Alexander II, was assassinated. At times, he seemed overwhelmed to be back in a land where, up to now, he had lived only in his imagination. The Grand Duke is trying to keep a low profile, much to the chagrin of ardent followers from a multitude of monarchist groups. These supporters traveled thousands of miles, but waited in vain at the airport to greet the second cousin of the last Tsar. While St. Petersburg residents welcome the name change, most view the Grand Duke's visit with equanimity. It's wonderful, she says. It's our history after all, and this is truly a remarkable moment in history. But he won't change our lives here. Maybe some good will come of this kind of visit, but it's more important now to get concrete help, he says, like help starting up private businesses. Still, in this city of the czars, full of architectural splendor, it's hard not to be caught up in the symbolism. St. Petersburg, once again named for its founder, Peter the Great, and his descendant and heir seeing it all for the first time. The Patriarch himself presided over a special service at the glittering St. Isaac's Cathedral in honor of the city's move to the future as it reaches back for its past. Claire Shipman, CNN, St. Petersburg.
A Philippine mayor says officials are so busy burying the dead and caring for the living, they don't have time to assess the damage from Tropical Storm Thelma. The storm struck 2 Philippine islands Tuesday. It caused floods and landslides and killed more than 3,300 people. Officials say rampant timber cutting may have contributed to the landslides by leaving mountainsides bare. Next up in CNN Headline Consumer News, a proposal from Congress on what some call a Robin Hood tax. And later, the younger the better these days in Hollywood.
This is CNN Headline News.